Greetings from the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals, and welcome to another installment of Let's Talk. We are just delighted to have this particular topic be addressed for direct support professionals, especially because it's a topic that we at the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals frequently we get requests for help with helping people through the grieving process when people die. My name is John Raffaele. I'm the Director of Educational Services at the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals, and we continue to bring these really, I think, very important and conversational webinars to our community. That I think our contribution to helping direct support professionals, especially, understand the very practical issues that they have to face every day in supporting people. These webinars are really useful, and that's the kind of design behind these webinars. And if you've been on these before, these Let's Talk webinars, you'll understand they're very conversational. They're almost like a radio show, and we want that. They're almost like a podcast. We want that. We don't want a lot of data and statistics. So those things are good. These webinars are all about the conversation. We want the conversation to continue. We want you to listen to this webinar, watch this webinar, and then take the ideas and talk about these ideas in your workplace. These webinars are a partnership, and we've been doing them how many years, Dave, now? 3+ years?
Oh, yeah, 3 or 4 years.
And they are companion webinars to the International Journal for Direct Support Professionals, which is published by our friends at VITA, Community Living Services, with sponsorship and support from HANDS, the Family Help Network in Canada. You can find these incredible journals in 3 different languages at this point on www.vitacls.org, which is the VITA Community Living Services website. They are archived, and it's a treasure trove, to be honest with you, when you look at all the different topics and all of these particular articles. The October 2019 issue is available. You can go to that website and get that. And just it's really please do that. And also next month, don't miss next month. We don't have the date set as of yet, but be on the lookout for next month's article, next month's journal, and what companion webinar will be the practicalities of kindness, and that's written by our moderator today, Dave Hingsburger. And there's where you, again, another visual of kind of what the journals look like. They're usually about 5 or maybe 6 pages. They're brief, but they're really powerful, and they're always loaded with really great information. So let's get to it. Our authors are there. You can see them if you're looking at the screen, or if you're listening. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them. First, Virginia Jahyu, who goes with pronouns she and her. She is a clinician and an arts therapist at VITA Community Living Services, and she was one of the authors of this particular journal article rather, and she'll probably tell you a little bit more about herself when she begins. And Amanda G. And Amanda is also a clinician, a registered psychotherapist, and an RCAT, which she'll explain. We don't have that in the United States, but in Canada, it's a certification, I'm assuming. Amanda goes, again, by the pronouns she and her. And they are our authors, and they're going to really drive this conversation. But ultimately, our moderator and our friend and colleague, Dave Hingsburger, will also be part of this conversation and kind of direct the questions that will drive the conversation. And Dave also is the Director of Clinical and Educational Services at VITA Community Living Services. And please correct me if I'm wrong on that, Dave. But I'm going to shush myself and let you folks take over this important conversation. So to you, Dave.
Okay. So maybe if we could get to the next slide, we can begin the conversation. So we always begin with this question with our authors. So why did you choose to write this article?
Well, we chose to write this article because there's definitely a demand for this topic. I often have people ask me in my workplace, what are the resources for staff? Are there resources out there for staff? And there really isn't a lot. And when you start working in this field, it's not your first thought that you're going to work with people. You think, I'm going to work with people, I'm going to help people, I'm going to do all this good work, but you don't think about the fact that people are going to die. So we don't get any training in this field typically on death, on how to process grief, how to manage it when someone you're supporting or working with dies. In a lot of fields like nursing, they would get a lot of training on this, and they'd be prepared even in school. And we typically come straight into the workplace, not even thinking about it probably as something that's going to happen.
Right. And to add to what you're saying, I think in the roles that we play, Amanda, we're based in relationships. And in relationships as support professionals, oftentimes, as you've just mentioned, we think about how to be companions, how to support each other. But oftentimes we do forget about that death piece, which is a very natural phenomenon as being a human being. So today we're hoping that by having this discussion, by writing this article, we can shed a little bit more light to this topic and to normalize this conversation so that it doesn't become highly stigmatized or fear-filled. So hopefully today's discussion can...
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed when I put in the announcement on Facebook about this particular article was that there was a fair number of people who responded fairly emotively to this. And it's like we're in human services. We work with human beings, and we have to think of all the different things that human beings do. But one of the things that they all do is die. And we forget sometimes that people with disabilities, like everybody else, has an expiration date, and that's something that we're going to have to deal with if we happen to have, I think, sometimes the honor and privilege of being there when that happens to provide support. Okay, John, if you could move along. So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about death in the workplace, and there's two different things that I'm thinking of in this question. We're talking about often we have coworkers who can become friends and part of our social circle, and we have people with disabilities that we provide support to, and though we're not friends, we have a very friendly, warm, and a relationship with them. So
yeah, I'm thinking when you're talking about people we support, so we're not friends, but you might work in their home 5 days a week and you're with them a lot, so of course it's going to have a major impact. I started working many years ago in this field, and it was numerous years before someone I was working with or doing any support with had passed away. But I can honestly say I have not forgotten every single death. I was thinking about this driving in today and thinking, I remember every single person who died, and because it had an impact in my workplace, in my life, just because they had died. And there is a relationship, even if it's different from family and friends. So of course your colleagues will die, and that is trauma as well. But I find it's so impactful when someone you're working with dies, because they're there one day and maybe not the next, or they've been sick for a long time and you kind of know it's coming, but there's no way to predict when these things are going to happen. Or maybe they are home from work for months because they have been sick, and then you get word when you come into work in the morning that they've died. Or there was an accident and something's happened, like someone's choked or something, or had a fall that then resulted in hospitalization, which results sometimes not often, but in death. And then sometimes it's a complication of their disability. Just recently I went into work and found out that someone had to have a surgery because of something that they needed help with, and they died from a complication of that. So there's often not any prep for that. You just walk in and find out, oh yeah, this person is no longer with us, but work needs to continue. So there's just a lot of ways that we experience death in this field.
Yeah, I know. I still remember the very first person who I was working with that died, and I was really surprised. At that point, I was a behavior therapist. I'd been in the field for a while, and I was really surprised. Not at the impact of his death, because of course there would be impact, but on how ill prepared I was, because he just happened to take a shower in the morning, step out of the shower, and just drop dead with a heart attack. And there was no warning. There was no time to process or think about this. And I had trouble shaking that. And I didn't know what to do with the grief, because expressing it at work made me feel like maybe I was being unprofessional, or because people say you get too involved and get quite critical of that. But how can you not be involved, and how can you not be affected when it's somebody?
Right. And you're a human being with emotions, you know,
Yes.
and no matter which professional roles and hats that we wear, we will process and have our emotions will be present. And Dave, when you were speaking about that situation, I think about expected death and unexpected death, and the impacts and the complications that come with both. Sounds like the story that you just shared was an unexpected death.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a preparation of a closing, of a ritual, if I may use that word, to start accepting the death and to perhaps have a conversation with some of our colleagues about it. Yeah, I think there has recently been a death in our VITA community that has impacted the agency at large. I personally didn't know this person, but I saw the people around me, my colleagues, be impacted, the emails that were sent around to share the grief. And for me, as a person who didn't personally know the person who has passed, certainly felt the impact of the death of that person. So even within the workplace, I was aware of the level of sensitivity when it comes to my languaging, even that I would use around my colleagues, and to check in with some people who may seem to be impacted a little bit more deeply. And that's based on the relationship that I have with my colleagues.
Yeah, one of the phenomenon that I've seen is that staff, it's an expected death and an unexpected one at the same time, because they're so busy doing things to care for the individual that they're processing the issue of care and not processing the issue of this person's dying. You know, because they have so many responsibilities to do, and they want to do them well, and to their credit, are putting a lot of emotional energy into giving that kind of support, and then suddenly the person passes away, and well, it should have been expected. That's not what they had been focused on.
Right.
And I think that that's one of the things that we have to think about when we actually work with people. You know, that we have to almost multitask in our heads, you know, and remind ourselves what it is that we're doing while we're doing it. So
part of my role in the agency in the past, it's hard to think about years, maybe 6-7 years, has been to go into homes or talk to teams after someone has passed away, because there was this gap in that, whereas someone would pass away and staff aren't given really a chance to process the death kind of together. So I started going into programs and helping both members and staff to process and to talk about it and giving space for people to talk about it. So I'd meet with the staff team and give them space to express their grief and encourage them to talk about it and to share that grief with each other, but also to share the grief with the people that they're supporting in the home, because again, we're human and we have feelings, and to not feel sad doesn't normalize that. Like if you are feeling sad and you shed a tear because someone has died, that's normal. And I don't think staff should have to hide that they're grieving. You were talking about not having a place for that grief.
Yeah.
I encourage staff, there is a level of professionalism that you need to maintain, lying on the floor weeping or, not being able to do your job. We need to try to still be able to do our job, but we also need to be able to express emotion and say, I'm feeling sad too. I miss them too. I'm really hurt by this too. And have that be a normal thing that we do, because often people with disabilities were hidden from grief or not allowed to participate in grief rituals or go to funerals. And it's really important to normalize this is something that we go through as people and that we have to live with. And it's sad and it's horrible, but we need to be able to express these emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really true when you're talking about people with intellectual disabilities who are constantly told to feel something other than what they feel.
Right.
And that's just in regular circumstances. I still remember somebody with disability saying to their staff, I'm hungry. And the staff said, you can't be, you've just eaten. And it's like, well, yeah, you can be. Yeah, you really can be. But that impulse to push away a feeling, and I've heard people with disabilities being told not to be sad. Like if their parents didn't come for an expected visit, or if something that they were looking forward to didn't happen or materialize because of whatever reason, and they express sadness. I've heard people with disabilities told, no, you should feel this, or you should feel happy that we're here. You should feel happy that we're doing something else. So I think we need to be really, really careful to have a sensitivity to the fact that people with disabilities need to have all of those feelings too.
Right. Instead of prescribing a feeling that they should feel.
Yes.
Because I think even as direct support professionals, when we share our feelings, we're also building a relationship. We're showing them what emotion, we're modeling expression, like true, authentic expression. And I absolutely agree that, there is a time when we're in our professional field where we have to, be mindful of how our grief is affecting us. And if we need to take time, we need to take time, because the truth is you can mask your feeling, but when you're holding that strong feeling and you're masking it, the truth is you're probably not very efficient at the job that you're doing right now. And you're not very present, and you're not serving the folks in the population that you're serving, efficiently. So, when I think about the debriefing process, Amanda, that you created and you do and you check in with the groups, we are creating space for feelings. That also, we're preventing isolation of feelings, right? Because oftentimes when an individual may feel one certain way and there's no space to speak about it and there's no response from other people, you may feel like you take it very personal, and we internalize that. And from a clinical perspective, when we internalize deep feelings, it manifests in many other different ways. That is quite problematic. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that was great. That was great. So, John, can we move to the next slide there, please? So, what role does empathy have to grief?
I think empathy goes actually hand in hand with grief, because when we speak about relationship and our feelings, it comes from a level of connection. So when we grieve for someone, it usually comes from because we have a connection or we have a relationship with the person and that has passed away, or the deceased, and that's why we grieve. But the empathy piece is also it plays an important role of entering the healing process of integrating the death into the person's regular life again. So that comes with the acceptance piece, the self-compassion for yourself, and understanding understanding that this death did happen, understanding the impact, and then how do we move forward from after experiencing all of this hardship. So the empathy is for others, and it can also work with ourselves. And that's the process that, again, helps us move forward from that experience.
For me, this goes back to, we're talking about like having empathy, going back to sharing your grief. Like if you are holding it all inside, you're not doing yourself a service, you're not taking care of yourself, and you're not taking care of the people around you. Because sharing, letting your coworkers share their feelings and sharing with your coworkers is a really good way to heal. And allow us to express those feelings. And, you know, that allows you to have empathy for your coworker, and your coworker to have empathy for you. And this also goes back to the normalization of feelings for me. Recently, I was working with a member whose mother had passed away, and staff kept telling her, don't cry. It's okay, don't cry. And I kept saying, cry. If you need to cry, cry. And I say that to staff too. If you need to cry, cry. And it's okay to shed a tear with somebody. It's okay, you know, that is empathy. That is having those feelings because you care about someone. And I did have a little tear with this individual about her mother, because I was feeling how much this was affecting her. And she was trying to hold it back because staff kept telling her, it's okay, you're going to be okay, don't cry. And she just really needed to express that. And staff often just really need to express that and to share it.
And I think it's very strange, this idea that not crying means it's better. You know, coming at this from just from a male perspective, I remember very clearly, learning a message about boys, and that's boys don't cry, and boys don't cry, you know. So we're allowed to feel rage, and we're allowed to feel things that lead to violence, you know, but not things that lead to healing, you know. I to this day have a great deal of difficulty with crying. I can't, so I have to go to a movie theater and see a sad movie and sit in the dark, usually about a dog or something, and then I can cry. But I have to create all of these things around to make it acceptable in my own head, you know, that I'm doing this. But I think that that's been done to people with disabilities as well. I don't think it's just to boys, you know, that they should be happy. I mean, I remember talking to a young woman with Down syndrome who was very upset about something and was crying. And I asked, you know, are you okay? And she looked up and almost fearfully said, happy? No, happy? You know, like, no. Like, I don't want to be in trouble. I don't want you to be mad at me. I don't want you to correct me. I don't want you to do any of that. You know, no, I'm happy. It's okay. You know, and I thought, how much damage is done to people by other people wanting to you used the word, commandeer, that wasn't a word you used, but commandeer other people's feelings, you know, and I'm not sure why that's a tendency for our work with people with disabilities.
And Dave, if I can take this even further, because you've mentioned your perspective as men and these social roles that were prescribed to you that you grew up really believing, and now you're living it, right? That when we talk about empathy too, I think that there also needs to be an understanding that not everyone processes grief with tears, and that there are some people who may be socialized, maybe naturally, they just don't really cry. And I think because I know myself and I know I would cry, I think naturally a lot of times I would have a tendency to believe that that would be a great outlet for other people. But that empathy piece piece also comes with that this ethical responsibility and understanding each person's social role, and that may not be the truth for someone else. That crime may not be the best solution for someone. So holding that space sensitively and creating space so that there's an option, and in understanding that if someone does cry, it's absolutely acceptable and it's not seen as a weakness, but also holding space that not everyone expresses through tears, pain, or grief.
Well, and I like the idea. And we did an article many years ago, which I still love and refer people to as on the idea of holding space for people with disabilities.
Right.
And I love that as a concept. And I think you're right. I think that fits really well here when we're talking about grief, creating the space for people to safely feel and to safely process. Because I'm not sure that people can move anywhere near healing unless they're feeling that they're in a safe space. If they're busy protecting themselves from other people or worried about the judgment of other people, I think that's really tough. So
definitely. And I think if I could add too, for some folks who work in agencies who have they're in positions of power, to have that level of empathy, like be reminded of that empathy, that when you have, a coworker or someone in the workplace that is really struggling, but maybe might have a difficult time in voicing that they need some time off, I highly encourage to practice that level of empathy and check in with the person and seeing, do they need some time off? What type of support do they need, instead of just brushing over, and I think that's also a responsibility, that when we're in leadership roles, to have that level of connection and relationship with our
and even if your organization has a benefit package that where there are other kinds of support, some people may not even know those things exist, so I think it's important, or forget about them when they need them,
I do a lot, since we got one here, I do a lot of saying, don't forget that we have this if you need it. And I've also noticed, to go back to what you were saying about noticing that someone's struggling, I think it's also a lot up to, not entirely up to supervisors, but up to supervisors to check in with their team if something's happened and say, how are you guys doing? And I've seen that a lot more in the past couple of years, where people have really been kind of tuned in to, my team is struggling, what do they need? Or more and more supervisors will contact me and say, this is what's happened, someone has died, what can we do? What resources do you have? What can I help them with? Can you come in? And it seems to be more and more that supervisors are noticing, and management is noticing, that this is a need, and bringing someone in to help when people need it.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to be aware of for the listeners is that we as an organization have you guys. Do you know what I mean? And have somebody who can go in and help process at a group home and so forth. But a lot of organizations simply won't have that level of support.
Yeah, there's also people that can call in, though. We've had here someone come in from victim services on a couple of occasions to help when it's been a traumatic death, and do counseling for both staff and members. And we've had someone come in and do a whole training on trauma because of something that happened in a home after a death. So we are very fortunate, but there are also other options to look into.
Yeah. But I think too that what I liked about the article was it suggests, at least to me as a reader, that even if you don't have all these things, there are these things that you can do.
Definitely.
And we'll move to that as we get to the end of the presentation. So could we move to the next slide? So how do you know if it's complicated grief, and what is complicated grief?
Complicated grief is I read an analogy about it earlier. It's like when you have a wound, you get a cut, and a cut heals, but sometimes a cut doesn't heal, and sometimes you get an infection, and that's kind of like complicated grief. Sometimes, normally when we have a grief, when we're experiencing grief, we can process through that without needing therapy, and it's not, doesn't take over your life. But with complicated grief, it's persistent, it's severe, it's things, thoughts and feelings that aren't going away, and that you aren't able to move on from the grief, and it's kind of taking over your life.
Right. It's a prolonged process of grief that really impacts your quality of life on all aspects. And what happens oftentimes is that complicated grief can lead to many other implications, such as depression, right? So I think that the differentiation that we need to understand is that depression is caused by chemical imbalance in the head, in the brain, while complicated grief is caused by the death of someone close to you. And oftentimes when we're processing our grief, we can, look into our circle of care, our friends, our colleagues for support. And oftentimes, if I can reference the depression, the 2 true blue weeks of consecutive deep feeling, when we experience this grief for over 2 weeks and it's consecutive and there's not even a moment of laughter or a moment of break from this, we can then start to look at this as complicated grief. And once an individual reaches a point of complicated grief, it's very important to actually seek for service and for additional professional help. And I know in the article we have outlined many different resources and practical ways that we can process and support each other and also ourselves as we go through this process. But also as clinicians, Amanda and I both also agree that once you notice that it's becoming complicated, once it's past an X amount of time, so I'm just going to use the framework for depression, the 2 true blue weeks, that's when maybe we need to start looking at additional resources and professional care for the feelings that we feel.
Well, I'm glad you brought forward the differentiation between grief and depression, because one of the things that I've wondered sometimes is if people haven't been able to spot the depression because they see it as grief, or they see that depression as a normal part of the grieving process. Mm-hmm. But they're quite distinct from one another.
And Dave, I think that it's really valid to because if I think about a Venn diagram, it's almost like that overlap, that feeling of depression, because many times with grief, even before it gets complicated, the symptoms are very similar. Mm-hmm. If we know in depression, for example, loss of appetite, maladaptive thoughts,
loss of interest in things that you enjoy,
loss of interest, like all these things come with grief, and it also comes in depression. But what differentiates it is that time frame of how long it lasts. And I think what we're trying to share with you all today with complicated grief is that once it passes an X amount of time, and it becomes a severe issue, and it can lead to more serious problems that can affect your quality of life.
And if it's going on and taking over your life, then don't be afraid to get help, to get support, to talk to your family doctor, to talk to a therapist, psychiatrist. There's things, I don't know, in Canada we have bereaved families, so different provinces like bereaved families of Ontario, and they have resources that you can access that are often through those areas free. So there's different ways you can seek out support. Or if you have an EAP, reach out to them, an employee assistance program. And there's nothing that really says what grief will become complicated, because sometimes there's a traumatic sudden death and you're able to move on fine, and sometimes you're not, or it's because it links back to another death that you experienced that you hadn't fully processed, and now you're dealing with both of those losses. And so there's no real way to say, oh, this one is going to be complicated. It just happens. And lots of people actually have undiagnosed complicated grief, and they just don't understand why they can't move on, and they're doing their best, but they haven't reached out and haven't gotten the support that they need to be able to move on from that.
And having complicated grief doesn't mean that you're a weak person or you weren't able to process it in an efficient way. your grief, you know, and it happens to a lot of us, and there is no cure for grief. You know, if we look into depression and we look from a clinical perspective, there's medications you can take, there's things, but when it comes to grief specifically, there isn't a cure for it. So it really is specific to each individual. And through the article, we try to offer a few different resources so you can maybe use these to see if it would be helpful. And, you know, we're also open to learning more ways of how other people can process grief.
Yes, yeah, and I don't think that it's ever healthy to put emotions on a timetable. You know, I mean, except in when you're looking to see whether or not maybe you need more intensive support or need more specific support. But I lost my grandmother on my father's side, who I was very, very close to, and to this very day, you know, I remember her, and I remember her as a wonderful woman, but those memories of her as a wonderful woman still come with a feeling of loss, you know, and there are moments that I really wish I could share with her, you know, and so I'm glad that I have her or had her in my life so that I could remember her and honor that memory. But every time I remember her, I also remember she's gone, you know, so, and I would be very annoyed if somebody told me, well, that was like 40 years ago, you should be over it. You know?
I would be annoyed too. And you know what, Dave, I'm going to actually use one of the words you just used when you said moments. There are moments where you think about the person, and of course you still feel those deep feelings of loss, but those are moments. That's not a consecutive, every single day, every moment of your life that you're consecutive. So I think that differentiation needs to be clear, that we're not definitely not saying that, you know, 40 years later, you think about it, it shouldn't make you sad. That's not what we're saying, because when you love someone with the loss, of course that memory stays with you, maybe for as long as you live, for the rest of your life. When you think about this person, great memory and loss will enter your body and those feelings that come with it. But it's important to differentiate if those moments are every moment.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, and I actually think, for me at least, they're healthy.
Yeah.
You know, it meant that I had the capacity to love and to feel loss. You know, and I think that's one of the things that grief says to you, is that, you know, if every now and then you need to be reminded that you're a loving person, well, when you're experiencing grief, that's kind of what that says, you know, is that you've lost something that matters to you. So.
And if I can get a little poetic here, I also think that when we think about people that have passed away from our lives, that have impacted us, I also think that that's part of legacy that they leave behind.
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely. Amanda and I were talking earlier about, you know, I wonder if people understood that if a moment of kindness that they could offer, or a moment of affirmation that they could do, could leave them remembered for the rest of somebody's life. You know, just so it's the power of what we do and when we do it and where we do it and so forth. So let's take a look at the next slide there. So what are some creative ways of processing grief?
This is the fun one.
And this comes directly from our field of creative art, creative therapies, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's lots of creative ways for processing grief. We talk about a lot in the article, like your self-care, finding things that you enjoy in life to do, whether that's exercising, making art, making music, going to the movies, things that you enjoy. These are all creative ways of processing grief. I find sometimes for me, if I'm feeling, well, I'm an art therapist, so this kind of speaks to my profession, but if I'm feeling big emotions, I will sit down and draw, or I will sit down and color or scribble or put color down on paper. And I find that really helpful for me to like kind of think about the thought that's in my mind, and to put it on paper as well as much as I can, or just use that cathartic process of getting it out of me. And that's how one way that I process grief. I often find too, for big emotions, getting physically moving in some way is important. So For me, going for a walk or playing outside with my kids or taking my dog out or anything that I can do that's physical helps to process those emotions.
Mm-hmm. And I think creative ways of dealing with things also gives us a way out of circular thought. Now, when I say circular thought, when I think about grief, I think oftentimes centralizing all our ideas and our thoughts on the death and how it makes us feel. But when we get creative, what happens is we create a doorway that momentarily, I mean, you most likely will return back to that center, but for a moment we take a break from that feeling by doing something creative. So as an expressive arts therapist, what we do is, through the different art forms, through music, you might want to listen to some music, you might want to make some music, you might want to do a dedication piece, write some poetry, you might want to do some dancing, just shake it off of your body. There are different ways that we can experience life while we're grieving that can remind us that there is actually, in fact, more to us in this moment than just the grief. And that's not to take away the honor from the grief and the feelings that we have, but being creative and finding little outlets to allow us to take a break from that circular thought can be very helpful. I think about expression, and there are many forms of expression, but I think about two ways that we express. One, to communicate to others, and the other to authentically just express the self, whether it's received or not. So when I think about creative ways of processing grief for myself, I think about that authentic expression, not meant for another person to hear or to communicate, but really for me to just let it out. Sometimes I do soundings, which is I close the door and I just make sounds with my mouth. And it just sounds bizarre. And I come out of the room and people are like, what was that? And I was like, it's my expression. And honestly, in that moment when I go, wah, and I create these sounds, it feels better for my body. So maybe that's something that some folks, if you're interested in trying out, that's some voice work, and that also works into voice therapy.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to now, I really want to hear some of the sounds. I have to admit, but I think once again that there's a broader framework around what you're talking about, because once again, none of that can be done in an environment where people don't feel safe to do that. An organization I worked at before here, a woman with disability had lost her boyfriend of many years. And I think it was like on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and there was a dance being held on the Friday at the Sheltered Industry, and she was determined that she was going to go, and she was being essentially told that she was a horrible person. How can you go off to this dance and when you've just lost your partner? And I remember stepping into that saying, hold on a second here. Like she gets to process it the way that she wants, and she gets to make those choices. I don't know if you read a really vicious article about Margaret Atwood in the newspaper. It was because of the publication of the new book. And she had an interview on one of the late night talk shows. I don't remember Jimmy Fallon, or I don't remember who it was. But she did that days after the death of her long-term partner. And she was being ripped to shreds as this cold-hearted, calculating person who was focused on herself and not this love of her life or whatever. Well, how do you know? Do how do you know? Maybe getting out of her house and maybe going off and doing something that was a result of many years' work was healing for her. And that's one of the things that I worry about, is people get ideas in their heads as to what grief is, how it should be processed, what's the right way to do it, and so forth, and forget that it's such an individualized pathway for everyone.
Yeah.
You know, and I really liked your analogy of having a door where you can just leave it for a moment, just leave it behind for a moment. You know, and if that woman who had wanted to go to the dance, if that's all that she wanted to do, was to get away from, you know, her own particular loss, who's to judge that?
Right. And in our field as direct support professionals, that's one of our roles and our duty, right? To support and to celebrate autonomy of an individual, their choices that they make, and how do we support them in that instead of, you know, enforcing our own ideas upon someone else. For example, of how grief looks like and how what the time frame should be. So I think that also speaks into our professional roles when we're working with our members and clients. Are we listening to what they need? If they're suggesting that they want to go to a dance party, even if there's a traumatic death in their family, maybe that's their way of, well, that's what they want to do. You know, and so as direct support professionals, one of our role is to support them in their autonomy and their decision making. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes our most important job is to just shut up. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Make space.
And that's in our personal and our professional lives.
Absolutely.
So, you know, there are times where your opinion really isn't what's needed. Your understanding is.
Absolutely.
You know, so
Dave, when you say that, just reminds me of allyship. You know what I mean? Like, how do we create more space and then move aside for this person to take the space that they need and they want?
Yeah, because again, that idea of holding space and holding a safe place for people to experience what they're experiencing. I'm not sure that level of care has been offered to people with disabilities for very long. You know, it's a relatively new concept, you know, when you talk to people about it. So
I think this is a good spot to talk about in the creative ways to manage grief is also celebrating the life if there's an opportunity. I often tell staff teams, you know, if you may not have the opportunity to go to a funeral, or there may not even be one, or, you know, it might be too difficult for everyone to go. So you could do something in your home. You could put up a photo. You could put up photos of the person who's died in the living room in a common area so that people, it opens up the conversation. We can remember people. Or we can do like a memory box where people can write their feelings and put them in a box with a person's picture on top of it. I've done that sometimes. But also, I always remember these things that used to happen at one of our day programs. And there was a priest who worked closely with our organization. And I'm forgetting his name right now, but he used to come whenever there was a death at the day program, and he would come and have a little service for people and open it up that anyone who wanted to could go to the front and share a memory, a thought, a song, anything about the person who had died. And they were really, really wonderful ceremonies because it was about feeling sad, but it was also about laughing and crying and singing, and it just brought such warmth. I remember they used to do these, like a token that you would take away about the person. So I remember one time getting a teddy bear with a hat on it. I don't know if you were.
I was around for that.
Or there was a plastic canvas heart one time, and it was for people who had died, and they wanted to give, like, where you go and get the funeral card, they wanted to give a memory to everybody. So these things were created for people to take with them. And they were really cherished, and it was a way for staff as well as the people, people with intellectual disabilities in the programs to celebrate and cry and mourn and laugh, and they were really wonderful. So if this is the creative way to process your grief, do something together if possible. Open something up like that where you invite people to come to share memories, and it doesn't have to be all sad. It can be whatever people need it to be.
And the fact that you're feeling grief means you had a connection which is now lost. And there is never a connection that doesn't have a story.
Exactly.
You know, and I love stories. You know, I love stories. And hearing some of those stories, I think is really helpful. you know,
Yeah.
for people. You know, I don't know if you didn't know the person, but when Manuela, who used to be the executive director here for 25 years, passed away, they put a plaque at the top of the stairs. And then we did some renovation work and so forth, and the plaque is no longer there. And it had her picture on it. And for all those years after she had passed away, I'd come out of the elevator and look at the picture of her and give her shit for dying, you know. And that was that was kind of emblematic of our relation anyway. But it's gone, you know. Now they've moved it and stuff, but it's not.
It was there.
It's not where it can be part of my routine anymore, and I've decided that I don't want to forget, you know. So
Did you talk to the spot?
I don't talk to the spot. That might be a little bit weird, but I do work a little bit harder at making sure that I maintain that connection, you know, because she's gone, but the connection's not, you know, and I think that that's something that can be honored, you know, is how people got to the point of connection, and you know what that meant.
People still all the time talk about her and programs that I'm in. And if you remember, we made those keychains.
Oh yes.
There were keychains made. I still have one. They're green and they had 3 beads on them that represented the practicing safety.
Yeah.
It's escaping me right now.
Practicing doesn't matter.
So it was the 3 things that she had just developed. It was you and her, I think, just before that she had passed away. And everyone got this keychain. It was green, it had a little tag on it. But these keychains are still floating around all over Vita, or people holding onto those because it's a memento of Manuela, and people remember that that's where it came from.
Yeah.
And I remember people would seek them out after, like, mine broke. Do they still exist? And there used to be a bag of them sitting at our front desk upstairs.
I love the metaphors and the meaning making that we can take when it comes to creative ways of grieving. Sounds like that story with creating that keychain for the person who has passed away was a symbolization of not only her legacy, and also the values of the agency that she created, she helped create and build. Right. I also, while we're talking about all this, I also think about the cultural values of each person and how important it is as people in this field, as direct support professionals, to also take the time to learn the culture in which the person exists in. Because I think about specifically my culture, at least my family practices when it comes to death and grieving, and celebration, laughter is not a part of it. And it's actually frowned upon. That I remember when my grandmother passed away, you had to wear all black, no jewelry, no makeup. You can't go to anyone's house for 1 month. No one can come to your house, and no smiling. And for me, that felt really oppressive. But I also was holding space. So that's my cultural tradition. So how, as a person, that's the intersectionality that's really interesting, right? So I think also in my role, I also take it as my ethical responsibility to learn the culture of that person and to know what's respectful. Because in my mind, I may think a story may bring joy and happiness, but I also am aware that I don't want to enforce that on someone else, because it may not be their cultural value. So when they go home, or when they have this, or you know, when they reflect back on how traditionally they carry out the grieving process, you know, when there's a discourse and when there's a disconnect, it can also, you know, be complicated for that person. It might be, you know, it might be confusing. Because for someone who may not have experienced that for the first time, it may be, well, I don't know, how am I supposed to do this? Because my colleagues and my support staff is telling me I should do this, but when I go home, this is what we do. So I think learning that piece is also important.
Definitely. Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it keeps coming back to there's a million different pathways. So, okay, so John.
Yes, I don't want it to stop. I don't want it to end.
I was going to ask if we had time for you to ask a question.
Oh, so many. No, I think you have covered this has been a beautiful conversation, and I think you covered so many practical aspects of what happens specifically when direct support professionals have to face death, and I think you really did a wonderful job. I have no questions. I have nothing but great admiration for this conversation and respect for all of you. And with that, we do have to wrap it up. But this conversation, I encourage everybody who's listening or viewing to continue and take note of these pearls of wisdom that we've just heard, and continue this conversation back in your organizations and back in your own lives, because it's one thing none of us are going to escape. And with that, I think this has been a beautiful conversation about a very difficult topic. And thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Virginia. And thank you, Dave, as always. We will see you next time, and you'll hear us next time. But until then, everybody, please take care, and and see you down the road. Thank you all.
Bye, John.
Bye.